Hello friends, good afternoon and welcome to EduSet Live Lectures. Dear friends, as you know, we have started a series on religion, culture and society in Indian history, and today we are conducting yet another lecture in the same series. In today's lecture, we will be talking about print and popular media. And in that, we will be talking about, and the title of the lecture would be The Midwife of Intellectual Change, Print Culture and its Implications in Colonial India in late 19th century, as well as Imagining the Nation, Popular Visual Culture and Early Nationalist Phase 1890 to 1910. To discuss this topic, we have with us our subject expert, Dr. Richa Raj. Dr. Raj is Assistant Professor in Department of History in Jesus and Mary College, University of Delhi. Without further ado, I would like to welcome ma'am to our studios and request her to start the lecture. Welcome, ma'am.
Thank you, Amrit. Friends, as Amrit just said, the title of the lecture today is The Midwife of Intellectual Change, Print Culture and its Implications in Colonial India, late 19th century. It's a part of the larger lecture series that we have been organizing. The title of that lecture series is called Religion, Society and Culture in Indian History. The title of this lecture, The Midwife of Intellectual Change, I have borrowed actually from a well-known historian called C.A. Bailey, who in 1999 had written about print capitalism, in which he said that print capitalism gave many existing communities of knowledge the capacity to operate on a wider scale. It was a midwife of intellectual change, not in itself the essence of that change. So therefore, the connotation of this is, friends, that the print capitalism or the entire commercialization that came about in various parts of the world due to print itself, or the notion of having newspapers, readability, and of course a reading sphere, it sort of created some kind of changes in the intellectual sphere, and therefore in the context of India too, we need to look at when was the time when newspapers began to be printed, published and read by the people, and what were the consequences of it. Did that too, as per Bailey, did that in India too bring about an intellectual change, is something that we need to look at. So first of all, I would go to look at how and or when were newspapers or the print media came about in India. So the first newspaper was actually published in 1780 by a person called James Augustus Hickey. The newspaper was called the Bengal Gazette. The circulation of newspapers, however, during this early period never exceeded a few hundreds. And it was therefore the newspapers, or the entire idea of having print in India was brought about by the Europeans in the 16th century in India, first by the Portuguese and then by the East India Company. But the first newspaper itself was published by Hickey, called the Bengal Gazette. And here, I've also given a picture, just put in a picture of the Bengal Gazette, which was first published by Hickey in 1780. Now, newspapers or any kind of print materials such as articles, pamphlets, journals, etc. began to be used extensively by the missionaries from late 18th century onwards, the primary objective of which was, of course, to spread Christianity. And but very importantly, they publish not only in English but also in the vernacular. And therefore, that brought about a fundamental shift in the way people began to read, what they began to read, the content that they were reading. And not only that, but also a streamlining of language became very important. So historian Charu Gupta has elaborated on how Indians' encounter with Europeans led to a fundamental shift in the way they viewed their language. No longer only as patrimony, but as a thing to be measured, known and used. Print greatly aided the growth of vernacular languages. Various languages like Bengali, Marathi and Tamil used print extensively for new kinds of knowledge production, social organization and political mobilization. So therefore, the print media became the vehicle for dissemination of knowledge production for its its production, its distribution, its reception, and of course which led to the organization and social organization and political mobilization as well. And therefore, who were the receptors of this kind of a knowledge production and its dissemination that was done mainly through print media? Mostly it was the dynamic new middle class that was being created from the late 18th century onwards, which comprised mostly the pandits, munshis, lawyers, and social reformers, who not only were the audience in the case of the print media, but they themselves became publishers in their own right, leading to the emergence of new kinds of literature. And therefore, amongst the important implications that we find is a very important, consequence, which is that of how new identities began to be forged as a result of this. The new print culture did not only bring to light the contradictions between the colonizer and the colonized, but also the contradictions within the colonized society itself, right? So therefore, amidst a lot of struggle and conflict, various indigenous upper and intermediate caste groups, educated middle classes, and religious groups articulated their ideas and thoughts. Through the print language and literature, these groups attempted to assert their power and representation, impacting on the resultant identity formations. So therefore, language became an important media for asserting identities. Print languages and literature were also vital instruments for crafting social identities. And in a competitive environment like colonial India, they offered substantial opportunities to indigenous groups to consolidate power along multiple axes of class, gender, and community. And this is a very important point because we also see this in the various kinds of social reforms that came about. Not only reforms that are related to gender and caste, but also certain kinds of reforms that were being introduced or that were being initiated or suggested by various social religious reformers as well. So therefore, debates related to religion, what constituted a particular religion, what were the evils of that religion, how should that religion be reformed, etc. All of that began to be discussed through the print medium, through articles in newspapers, through pamphlets which were distributed by various social religious reform movements, and so on. And therefore, the print became an important medium through which religious differences were debated. For example, between Sanatan Dharma and Arya Samaj, between Christianity and Hinduism, between Orthodox Islam and Sufism, and Islam and Hinduism. So differences could be discussed, they could be thrashed out, they could be debated upon, and in the print medium itself, and therefore that led to not only further consolidation of religious identities, but also led to, in many cases, like in the Arya Samaj movement by the late 19th century, into advocating certain reforms of Hinduism or any other religious group. Apart from the social religious reform movements that came about or served or for which the print media served an important role, in the case of gender reform as well, and other social reforms too, the print media played a very important role. So various issues like sati, widow remarriage, women's education, the age of consent controversy that came about by the late 19th century, Hindu superstitious practices, etc., were discussed widely in press and print. And through these, the social reformers were able to spread their ideas, attempting to reform both the private as well as the public spheres. Friends, this was a very important consequences of the introduction of the print medium by the Europeans. Now, many journals also, therefore began carrying writings by women. As the spread of education increased the number of women who could read in middle class homes. So we have the case of Raj Sundari Devi, a young married girl in a very orthodox household in Bengal, who wrote her biography in Amar Jeevan, or My Life, which was published in 1876. In the 1880s, women like Tarabai Shinde and Pandita Ramabai used print to passionately express their anger against the miserable lives of upper caste Hindu women, especially widows. So, as far as reforms related to women were concerned, it's quite another thing that one could debate over how successful those reforms were. But yet, in order to bring these ideas, related to how, there was gross injustice being done to women on various occasions, primarily in the practice of sati, in not allowing, putting up a societal, boycott on widow remarriage amongst the upper caste society. So, at least to talk about such ideas, the print played a very important role. And what is more important is that, with the dissemination of ideas through the print medium at a larger scale, more and more people began to read it. And also the fact that, many of these ideas were disseminated through cheaply printed, cheap printed pamphlets which are not very expensive, and therefore they could be read by any literate person belonging to any class, right? So therefore, so this was very important. These ideas began to percolate more and more households as opposed to earlier. And more importantly, women themselves began to talk about their own issues. They began to write. They began to publish their articles in the journals. Began to write their own autobiographies, etc. So this was a very important consequence of the print medium. So not only related to gender, but also related to caste and class exploitation. One finds that in 1938 in Kanpur, a mill worker, Kashi Baba, wrote Chote aur Bade ka Sawal, showing the links between caste and class exploitation. So therefore, this was a very important medium of spreading ideas or disseminating one's ideas. Now, language had a very important role to play in the politics of the United Provinces, and we'll just take up the example of United Provinces, in which how the print media played a very important role in consolidating linguistic ideas. And Charu Gupta has also explained this about how the emergence of print led to the consolidation of Hindi language and Hindu identity in the United Provinces. In the 19th century in the United Provinces, she says, the languages of Urdu and Hindi became, both among the Muslim gentry and the Hindu upper caste, a means and symbol of community creation. By late 19th century, Hindi appeared to have emerged with the upper hand in this conflict. The power of print was used effectively by the upper caste Hindu literati to establish a standardized Khadi Boli Hindi. For example, there were important newspapers and journals that were published in the United Provinces at that time, and Saraswati, Chand and Abhyudaya are important amongst those that were very important for shaping up a certain kind of a Hindu identity through the consolidation of Hindi as a language. In Bengal as well, the print media also therefore led to a sort of a vernacularization of language per se. For example, in Bengal, Bengali rose to prominence as a vernacular language from the late 18th century onwards, marginalizing the importance of Persian and Sanskrit among the educated groups in Bengal. So, with the introduction of the print media, more and more people began to read in Bengali, and therefore a need felt to standardize Bengali or to bring it into common usage, and therefore to streamline it in a particular way, which further led to the marginalization of Persian, which earlier was the official language which was used under the Mughals, and also Sanskrit marginalization also happened amongst the educated groups in Bengal. The print market and commercial press developed slowly but steadily, but grew extensively in many parts of India in the second half of the 19th century, coinciding with the rise of printed vernacular languages. It became a means of disseminating and mediating literature independently of the official channels, sites, and practices sanctioned by universities, government publications, and elite literary circles. Now, one of the important innovations of the print media was the visual culture. The publishing not only of articles or journals or newspapers, etc., but also the publishing of calendar, of printed posters, etc. And therefore, this was the visual culture became widespread from the late 19th century onwards, and this was primarily because of various innovations that were coming about in Europe, namely the printing technology, and from Europe it was brought to India by the second half of the 19th century. So therefore, modern innovations, namely printing technology and the processes of mechanical reproduction that flourished independently of the government, gradually began to turn urban India into a visual society dominated by the printed image. According to Partha Mitter, they affected equally the elite and the ordinary people. Lithographic prints served a mass market that cut across class barriers, while pictorial journalism became an indispensable part of literate culture. The educated enjoyed a rich harvest of illustrated magazines, picture books for children, and cartoons. The appearance of high-quality plates lent greater credibility to writings on art. As printing presses mushroomed, these publications reinforced public taste for academic art. And this therefore, the idea of having picture books, the idea of having calendars, of having cartoons, etc., gave it sort of produced greater interest in reading newspapers, articles, and journals, and so on. And therefore, one important genre that I want to discuss particularly is that of the comic genre. And satirical illustrations became prominent by the late 19th century. In India, most of the journals or most of the magazines that focused on satirical illustrations, they were inspired by the British and the French comic magazines. And particularly, here I want to bring your attention to one satirical magazine called the Indian Shiravari. Now, this was English owned. It began to be published in India from the 1870s onwards, but it was inspired by the British satirical magazine called The Punch. And the Indian Shiravari was full of racial malice through its witty caricatures of the Bengali character. The Indian Shiravari took potshots at nationalist papers that attacked the British monopoly of the Indian civil services. It systematically impugned the character of the Bhadralok, their lack of integrity and crass incompetence. It created the quintessential Babu character in Bhagwati Bose, M.A., a character or a cartoon character was created by the Indian Shiravari after the Bengali Babu, whose purported letters appeared in the magazine. These cleverly exploited the Bengali habit of translating a Bengali idiom literally into English. So the Indian Shiravari was focused on making fun of the Bengali elite, the Bengali Bhadralok, or the upper caste, educated, Western English educated elite. And the reason was that, by the end of the 19th century, the Bengali elite had become quite articulate in their criticisms of the British government. Primarily, the fact that this particular Bhadralok community had become westernized, had been educated, but there was not an equivalent employment, there were no equivalent employment opportunities for this particular Bengali elite. And there were, these aspirations, the idea that their employment or the job opportunities for them should be equivalent to their education. And therefore, many of them aspired for the Indian civil services as well. Bengali Bhadralok. Yet this met, their aspirations to compete in the Indian civil services met with a stiff opposition from the conservative factions within the British society. And the Bengali elite often criticized the monopoly that was established of the British over the Indian civil services, and therefore the Shiravari, sort of made fun of this Bengali character. The way the Bengali character, it kind of created a character called Bhagwati Bose, and how Bhagwati Bose spoke English in a particular manner. How there was this entire habit of the Bengali elite to literally translate a Bengali idiom into English, which often led to the creation of funny phrases. So it was to, this entire, the tone of Indian Shiravari was definitely full of racial malice. It was filled with a sense of Victorian supremacy, a sense of Victorian respectability that looked down on any Indian, primarily the Bengali elite, which aspired to the Indian civil services. And this was, primarily, very importantly, what we need to see is that, the 1870s was also the time when one of the important, Indian leaders, who later became a member of the Indian National Congress, Surendranath Banerjee, had competed for the Indian civil services despite stiff opposition, and he had been thrown out of the civil services on a flimsy charge, and therefore this had led to a huge furor amongst the Indian faction against the monopoly of the British over the Indian civil services. So the Indian Shiravari therefore made caricatures of the Bengali Bhadralok, and caricatures thrive on hostility. They thrive on consensus, on the idea of us against them, on of course the idea of trying to make fun of imperfections in humans, yet there is definitely an idea of fun mixed with hostility, of us versus them. And this came through very clearly in the Indian Shiravari. And here I've just kind of given, it will come to you on the screen now, just the front page of the British Punch on the left hand side, and on the right hand side the front page of the Indian Shiravari. Therefore, this kind of caricaturing or the idea of having cartoons soon appeared in papers owned by Indians as well, as colonial administration became the legitimate target of journalists. So the nationalist paper of Bengal, primarily the Amrit Bazar Patrika, published its first cartoon in 1872. So the Indian or the indigenous newspapers too began to publish illustrations or caricatures and cartoons, etc., in their criticism of the colonial administration. For Partha Mittar, one of the earliest cartoons to make a political impact was in Sulabh Samachar in the 1870s. Its message foreshadowed the Ilbert Bill, which was being discussed in 1882, which sought to abolish the immunity of European offenders to being tried by Indian judges, a government measure fought tooth and nail by the expatriate British. Sulabh Samachar put the Indian case forcefully by highlighting the blatant injustice. Often poorer sections of the Indians were assaulted by Europeans, leading to their death. If the case came to court at all, the enlarged spleen of the victim was blamed for his death. The cartoon shows a dead coolie with his weeping wife by his side. A European doctor conducts a perfunctory post-mortem while the offender stands nonchalantly smoking a cigar. This suggestion of collusion between European judges and offenders did have an impact, if not the intended one. It was among the incriminating evidence that led to the vernacular press censorship of 1878. Right? So therefore, what we find is that the use of illustrations became rampant in the Indian-owned presses as well. And Bipin Chandra, in his book India's Struggle for Independence, has elaborated how in the initial years of the Indian National Congress between 1885 and 1918, when it had still not resorted to mass agitations, press became an important means for politicization, political propaganda, education, and propagation of nationalist ideologies. Interestingly, nearly one-third of the founding fathers of the Congress in 1885 were journalists. Powerful newspapers emerged during these years under distinguished and fearless journalists. These included The Hindu under G. Subramanya Iyer, Kesari and Maratha under B.G. Tilak, Bengali under Surendranath Banerjee, and Amrit Bazar Patrika under Shishir Kumar Ghosh. Most of the newspapers were not in those days business enterprises, nor were the editors and journalists professionals. Newspapers were published as a national or public service. They were often framed as objects of philanthropy. To be a journalist was often to be a political worker and an agitator at considerable self-sacrifice. Many of the major social and political controversies of the day were conducted through print and press. We have therefore, the indigenous reaction as well, to the colonial government through the newspapers. And now we would look at how did the colonial government react to blatant criticism of the indigenous press of the colonial government. And therefore, especially after 1857, the vernacular press had become more and more vocal in its criticism against British policies, and especially the terrible famine of 1876 to 77, which took a toll of over 6 million people, combined with the vulgar and lavish expenditure by Lord Lytton at the same time on the imperial darbar at Delhi, aroused the indigenous press. The British government on its part enacted stringent laws to curb press freedom. It became very important to put a curb to press freedom. From 1870, Section 12A of the Indian Penal Code stated that whoever attempted to excite feelings of disaffection to the government established by law in British India was to be punished with transportation for life or for any terms or with imprisonment up to 3 years. So the colonial government therefore sought strict measures to stifle the indigenous voice. In retaliation, the government also imposed the Vernacular Press Act of 1878, directed only against Indian language newspapers. The act was designed to empower the government with more effective means of punishing and repressing seditious writings. It provided for the confiscation of the printing press, paper, and other materials of a newspaper if the government believed that it was publishing such material. No appeal could be made to a court of law against it. Regarding the role of the nationalist press, Lord Dufferin, the Viceroy, wrote as early as March 1886, "Day after day, hundreds of sharp-witted babus pour forth their indignation against their English oppressors in very pungent and effective diatribe." Later, the government also began to ban other artifacts which had anti-colonial writings in it. And a very interesting example, which I particularly want to talk about here, was, as recounted by Christopher Piney, is that of a dhoti that was sold in Calcutta in 1910, on which was printed a song in praise of Khudiram Bose, who had been executed in 1908. The Bengali text ran thus: "Mother, farewell, I shall go to the gallows with a smile. The people of India will see this. One bomb will kill a man. There are lakhs of bombs in our houses. Mother, what can the English do?" The appearance of this dhoti triggered a surreal debate as to whether it could be considered a document under Section 2(6) of the Indian Press Act of 1910. It was finally deemed to be so by the government, who declared that all such dhotis would be forfeited to the government. The Indian leader who is most frequently associated with the struggle for the freedom of the press during the early nationalist movement is Bal Gangadhar Tilak. In 1881, along with G.G. Agarkar, he founded the newspaper Kesari and Maratha. In 1888, he took over the two papers and used their columns to spread discontent against British rule and to preach national resistance to it. So friends, the advent of print culture in India, therefore, was able to bring about an intellectual change in India through a transmission of attitudes and ideas that helped in both reinforcing the imperialist hegemony as well as in creating a resistance to it. Thank you. Hello friends, we are going to begin with the lecture on Imagining the Nation, Popular Visual Culture and the Early Nationalist Phase 1890 to 1910. This is a part of the larger lecture series called Religion, Society and Culture in Indian History in which many lectures have been conducted earlier. Friends, I'm going to discuss in this lecture how a certain kind of an art, which one could call an Indian art, came into being by late 19th century. And this particular art was, in some ways very different from the kind of art that was being propagated through the academies that were mostly, patronized by the British Raj. And therefore, in this lecture, we are going to look at what were the various forces that led to a new kind of art that emerged. How did that kind of play around with the nationalist idioms, that were there in the political scenario, and how did that, in what kinds of iconography, in what kind of iconography did that particular kind of Indian art manifest itself into. So therefore, the late 19th century was a conjunction of many forces in colonial India, which helped to define a specific character of Indian art, which can be called a non-classical tradition. Now, these were the developments that included a certain disenchantment with Western education. A certain kind of a particular group was emerging by the late 19th century, which began to become disenchanted with Western education and all kinds of Westernization, and there was a renewed confidence in Hindu civilization, along with a changing outlook on progress and its artistic expression, as well as a changing outlook on academic naturalism in art, right? And this, along with the ensuing Swadeshi or indigenous ideology, of art, came about, that thrived on the dichotomy between the spiritual East and the materialist West. So, what we are going to look at is how the Indian art that emerged in a colonial milieu by the late 19th century was situated in a certain kind of dichotomy between the West, which was described as a more materialist or a commercialized part of the world, and the East, which had begun to be seen as a more spiritual, a non-commercialized part of the world. So it was in this dichotomy between the East and the West that the emerging or the new form of Indian art by the late 19th century can be located. Now, there were very important or significant indigenous presses that came into being by the late 19th century. And, any discussion on art of the second half of the 19th century is incomplete without the mention of a very renowned artist of that time called Raja Ravi Varma. He was the most influential shaper of modern Indian iconography in late 19th century India. He was also known as the father of modern Indian art. Varma was a successful artist from Travancore, known for portrait painting and decorating for the Indian princes and upper echelons of British administrators. His large canvases were devoted to religious and epic Indian themes. His renderings of these epics and mythological narratives followed a European style, especially taking inspiration from European Renaissance art. But also along with that, there was a synthesis of a model based on the European Renaissance art with the Indian flavor in the draperies and the adornments to pass for Indian realism. As you can see in the picture on the screen, there is a picture of Raja Ravi, a painting by Raja Ravi Varma, in which the portrait, you may have just seen it before this. The painting is called Hansa Damayanti, right? And here, yes, it's just flashed on the screen here. And here you see this is one of the very important paintings of Raja Ravi Varma, in which the style is very much can be seen as being influenced by the Renaissance art. Yet at the same time, the draperies, adornments, the idea of having Hansa and the woman, the jewelry that the woman is wearing, the hairstyle, and of course the clothing and everything is very Indian. So it kind of depicts an Indian realism. In 1894, Ravi Varma bought 2 steam-driven lithographic speed presses from Germany. These presses, available in Germany since the 1850s, were instrumental in industrializing the production of color pictures. Ravi Varma also imported the manpower and, along with that, the disciplined organization necessary for setting up the infrastructure for industrial printing. For Irvin Neumayer, who's an art historian or ethnologist, this was in the best sense Swadeshi. Indian capital bought not only the means of production but also the know-how to produce and distribute works of indigenous ideological content and value. Therefore, the triangle of producer, distributor and receptor was all under Swadeshi control. Ravi Varma thus functioned as artist, cum producer, cum distributor, all rolled into one. Now, there was another important press apart from the one that was owned by Raja Ravi Varma in Maharashtra. The Chitrashala press became very important, which was established in 1878 by Vishnu Krishna Chiplankar, or Vishnu Shastri as he was fondly known. It was right from the beginning a true two-pronged undertaking. One part was the Arya Bhushan, a letter press producing the two famous newspapers, the Maratha and Kesari of Tilak fame. The other section was the Chitrashala press, which became famous for its display prints of historic personalities and mythological scenes. Christopher Pinney makes it clear that the press was functioning in the closely knit, ideologically charged society of the Marathi nationalists. So therefore, what we find is that the Indians, they begin to own their own presses and therefore publish not only books but also newspapers to propagate criticism of the colonial government and to propagate a nationalistic ideology. The late 19th century was the phase of cultural nationalism, and therefore, and this is also, many historians have also discussed how nationalism, the early phase of nationalism, was a sort of, it was colored with a certain kind of a cultural idiom. So therefore, in the late 19th century, it became important to reclaim one's cultural past from the foreigners. Even though traces of Orientalism could be seen in indigenous works of art, attempts were simultaneously being made to break away from it. And very importantly, not only in terms of art, a new kind of art began to be created, but also in terms of writing about art. How the Indian art was very different from the Western art. And this is particularly seen in the writings of the historian at that time called Rajendra Lal Mitra. Rajendra Lal Mitra questioned the Eurocentric assumption about ancient Indian art, right? And he challenged it. He was the founder member of the European-dominated Photographic Society of India, which was started in 1856, but he was also expelled from it, because of the anger that was caused against him among the pro-planter faction in this particular society, because he had, a year later, by 1857, he had in a very spirited manner defended the indigo peasants who had revolted against the planters. And therefore, because of his defense of the indigo peasants a year later, he was expelled from the Photographic Society of India. Nonetheless, that did not keep him from talking about giving a critique of the colonial government, and also in terms of art. And in his book called The Origins of Indian Architecture, which was published in 1870, Mitra challenged a commonplace among Western scholars such as James Ferguson that the Hindus had learnt stone architecture from their Greek conquerors. This was challenged by Rajendra Lal Mitra, right? And so not only Rajendra Lal Mitra, but we also have other figures in the late 19th century who began to create in their own way a certain ideology for the new kind of nationalistic art that began to be created from late 19th century onwards. And these are two leading cultural figures of the time, primarily Swami Vivekanand, Rabindranath Tagore and his nephew Balendranath. For Partha Mitter, their thinking reveals both the naturalistic foundations of colonial art and their acute ambivalence towards it, right? So for instance, Swami Vivekanand, who had stirred Western imagination with his Chicago address in 1893, was a fervent Pan-Asianist. The very soul of Asia, he claimed, was interwoven with this art. Colonialism had destroyed this religious spirit. The architecture of Calcutta, for instance, was commonplace, devoid of higher symbolism. right? So therefore, Swami Vivekananda pitted a sort of Pan-Asianism against Western culture, right? The second cultural figure was also a mentor of Swadeshi nationalism of early 20th century. During the Swadeshi agitation of 1905, Rabindranath Tagore made a hostile public pronouncement on academic art, usually patronized by the British government or Europeans. His purpose was clearly to question the Bhadralok cultural dependence on Europe. In Self-Rule, published in 1905, he rejected Western values altogether because of their alien character. The third leading cultural figure of this time was Balendranath Tagore, who in his essay The Art Gallery of Delhi, published in 1898, dwelt on the differences between Mughal and Rajput miniature paintings and colonial art. Colonial art was of course influenced by classical naturalism. For Balendranath Tagore, Indian miniatures were quite unlike Western paintings in their ideas, compositions and color schemes, and in their serenity, all of which reflected Eastern mentality and experience, right? So therefore, for Partha Mithra, therefore it was in the wake of the first major political upheaval of 1905, which was against the partition of Bengal that was brought about at Lord Curzon's behest. Renaissance naturalism simply began to be seen against the grain of Indian culture. So in the art academies that were patronized by the British government at the time in Calcutta and in other parts of India, basically the kind of art that was being taught was inspired by Renaissance naturalism, right? So most of the artists at that time painted or created works of art that were can be seen close to the European Renaissance art. But by the late 19th century and primarily early 20th century, because of the Swadeshi movement, the entire emphasis on self-reliance, on self-respect, etc., this therefore began to this kind of Renaissance naturalism being propagated in the academies, art academies, began to be seen as going against Indian culture, right? Instead, what was advocated was a flat, linear artistic style was identified with the essence of Hindu India, the kind of miniatures, the Rajput and the Mughal miniatures that were available at that time. And therefore, many cultural figures began to advocate an emulation or an inspiration from those miniatures, from the Rajput and the Mughal miniatures, rather than the classical form of art that was being taught in the institutionalized academies. Right? So therefore, Indian art was taken over by nationalists when they set out to assert their cultural identity. The innate differences between Indians and Europeans expressed different artistic spirits. In short, the phoenix of nationalist art rose on the ashes of the Victorian art in India by the end of the 19th century. And the Swadeshi movement had an important role to play in this development. This was, of course, as I said, against the partition of Bengal, and it led to great widespread unrest in India with a demand for Swaraj or self-rule. And the chosen weapon was Swadeshi or indigenousness. Everything that was indigenous had to be advocated to rise against the British injustice of the partitioning of Bengal. So in the Swadeshi movement, what was seen? It was seen as an economic war against the Raj on two fronts. One, there had to be a boycott of British goods while promoting indigenous manufacturers. The call for self-reliance also spilled over into the domain of art, encouraging artists to use it as a political weapon. Now, while we are on the Swadeshi movement, it is important to understand the Swadeshi movement, which started in 1905, this was primarily to resist the free import of British goods or British manufactured goods in India, through which India was being converted from a manufactured goods producing country into a market for British manufactured goods, into a huge market for goods made in Britain. And at the same time, there was a monopoly of raw materials that were feeding the industries of Britain. right? And this was in turn leading to a gradual decline of industries, of handicrafts and small scale industries in India. And therefore, it was against this economic injustice or economic exploitation that the Swadeshi movement was also called for. The immediate reason was, of course, the partitioning of Bengal, but the long term or the larger critique of the British government was also how the British government was economically exploiting India, and that therefore kind of led to corroding of the moral authority of the British Raj as well. And therefore this kind of a discontent against the government, this kind of an emphasis, the Swadeshi movement therefore emphasized on indigenous, everything Swadeshi, to produce, not to consume goods that were made in Britain, but to produce goods in India itself, so that the Indians or the people, the local artisans or the manufacturers, etc., could benefit out of it. So this emphasis on indigenousness, this emphasis on Swadeshi, therefore spilled over in the domain of art as well, and it kind of encouraged artists to use it as a political weapon, right? And therefore the excitement of the Swadeshi movement elicited from a very important artist called Abanindranath Tagore, the Bharat Mata or Mother India. For the first time in 1906, Bharat Mata was created by Abanindranath Tagore, who personified Bharat Mata as a Bengali woman holding 4 symbolic objects in the conventional manner of a Hindu deity. I have the picture here to show. This was the first Bharat Mata that was created by Abanindranath Tagore in 1906. Now, this particular image showed that the emblems of nationalist aspiration towards economic and cultural self-sufficiency. So you can see the Bharat Mata is holding Ann. So food was important for national self-sufficiency. Wisdom was also important. Clothing as well as diksha or spiritual knowledge, right? So therefore, shiksha, diksha, clothing, as well as anna or food was important to bring about self-reliance in the country. So this was definitely a political message that Abanindranath Tagore was trying to convey through his depiction of the Bharat Mata. Now there was another important Indian tradition of fresco buono murals that was taught usually in India, taught by a master craftsman with local materials, mostly carried out in Rajasthan, especially Jaipur. Now, Abanindranath Tagore was invited in 1905 to prepare designs in frescoes for the new Calcutta Art Gallery. Among some of his tentative sketches on stone, Kacha and Devajani, as shown in the slide here, are the best known. The public mural project was realized in Jagdish Bose's institute, where Nandalal decorated the Great Hall with an allegorical subject. But murals did not flourish until the 1920s as Shanti Niketan under Nandalal. Now, when we look at the iconography or the early popular prints, up till now we looked at the paintings. Now, if you look at the popular prints as well, then ethnologist Irwin Neumayer has made a very important point, and he says that the images belonging to early fine arts printing presses carried forward the decolonization of imagery and autochthonous iconography and a progressive indigenization of style and metaphor. By the end of the 19th century, India imported oleographic prints mainly from Germany and England. These prints were mostly advertisements for processed imports like textiles, tobacco, dyestuff, and many other products that flooded the Indian market. It was this market situation, the free import of processed English goods, that was opposed by the national bourgeois, which by then wanted India to develop its own industries. Since religious symbolism was very often used in early nationalist propaganda, the early nationalist prints sometimes served to exclude or even antagonize non-Hindu Indian communities. One such genre was that of the Holy Cow prints, where Mother India and the Holy Cow are conflated into one, where the cow contains within her body all the sacred spaces of India, where the sun and moon and many Hindu gods make up the body of the wish-fulfilling cow. Right? Now, I have here, a picture of the Bharat Mata, which is actually an advertisement for Swadeshi textile mills. And it is a very interesting, imagery in which the Bharat Mata, and this is an advertisement for the Ahmedabad new textile mills of the late 19th century. The Bharat Mata here, of course, is called the Hind Devi. She is draped in a beautiful pink sari. Probably that, and that is, of course, the advertisement for the sari or the textile that was manufactured in this particular textile mill. So you see how indigenousness or the idea of self-reliance or manufacturing goods in India itself also began to be used as a political weapon in the country through the creation of Bharat Mata in such a manner. Many religious icons, as I just said earlier, also had hidden political connotations. Such prints at times made it to the court chambers, but this did not really resolve the issue. On the contrary, the hidden meanings of such prints became visible to everyone. A print issued at the Raja Ravi Varma press was the subject of court inquiry in 1910 to 11 and was censored in Bombay and the central provinces. The British government interpreted the image as an anti-cow killing image, and by censoring it hoped to diffuse the already charged situation, that is the Hindu-Muslim situation, since according to the British government, the representation was likely to incite acts of violence and to bring into hatred and contempt certain classes of His Majesty's subjects in British India. So the picture that I have put in the slide here is, probably not. It is not the picture that went to court, but it's just an illustration of how such kind of a picture was seen by the British government as capable of arousing some kind of hatred amongst the Hindus and the Muslim community. And in this particular court case that I'm talking about, the British government urged the press, the Ravi Varma press, to give the cow in the corner of the picture a bovine, the image of a buffalo, that he should look like a buffalo rather than a cow, right? Friends, there was just another point that I want to talk about, is that of Pan-Asianism and Swadeshi art. Now, Partha Mitter has brought this out very beautifully about how Pan-Asianism, or the Eastern form of the Romantic ideology against Western progress, had a direct impact on Bengali artists in their perception of Swadeshi art as Oriental rather than Indian. This is seen by him in the interactions between Japanese artist Kakuzo Okakura Tenshin, who came to India in 1902. He arrived at Calcutta then, intending to study Buddhist art in the original and to take Vivekananda with him to Japan. But the monk had died that year. Now, it's very important to see, to look at the interactions between Okakura and the Bengali artists. Now, Okakura was immensely critical of westernization of Japan and was widening the Pan-Asian struggle by enlisting the support of like-minded Asians, Swami Vivekananda and the Tagores. His teacher, the American Fenollosa, held up Asian spirituality as an antidote to European commercialism and materialist Renaissance art. And therefore, Okakura's Ideals of the East, published in 1903, was widely welcomed by Indian nationalists. He was seen as a bearer of a Pan-Asian mission to unite Asia against Western imperialism. Therefore, in conclusion, what I would like to say is that the popular visual culture of late 19th and early 20th century India represented a rejection of European materialism and a move towards Eastern spirituality. It meant revival of mostly Hindu cultural symbols and iconography. In a plural society like India, with multiple communities, this was a contradiction that was left for the later nationalists to confront and resolve. With this, I end here. Thank you.
Dear friends, due to paucity of time, we have to stop our lecture here. On that note, we would like to thank Dr. Raj for coming to our show and delivering this wonderful lecture. And thank you, dear friends, for watching our lecture. Stay tuned and keep watching. Thank you.